All right, so here's a section on the grid. So the grid is it's a page layout tool that graphic designers often use. There's books called The Grid or Utilizing the Grid. There's a bunch of different things, but the main idea behind it is that you use a grid like a table kind of idea to lay out your design. Before you actually create it, to lay out the composition. All right, so even if you look up here when I was showing the wireframe, this is a grid, right? So you can see that there's some of these elements actually line up to certain lines. Okay, so this is a grid type thing. Now that it just generally makes sense to lay out your designs that way instead of having just elements willy-nilly, put a picture over here and then I just have text over here and then this goes over here. You'll notice that pretty much everything that you read pretty much everything you read, right? So anything like magazines or news articles or web pages, whatever, they all utilize the grid in some manner because you have to have everything kind of sectionated, right? And so that just generally works. So some benefits of it is that generally our content is already rectilinear, right? So we have blocks of text. They're in a squarish, a rectangular, form. Images are all naturally square, right, of some sort. Now, obviously, you can have images that are round, or you can have them cut out. But the actual image, if you were to look at it without the formatting, is still actually a square. If you have videos, those are also all square. Okay, so it just makes sense. They'll fit into a grid pretty well. It'll help force alignment, which makes your designs more cohesive. So because I'm using a grid here, you can see this slider and this services and this about us, they all line up to this left-hand side, right? And the slogan and what have you. So it helps keep things aligned and orderly. You can group elements that go together into nice little blocks. So, for instance, when I was talking about, we can have a header section here, right? And then you'd have your main section here, and then you have a footer section, and then you can have a section for section, and then you can have articles in that section. That works pretty well when you're doing that in the grid. And the last thing, which is probably honestly maybe the most valuable, or at least as far as for the web, is that the grids themselves can be expanded or shifted. So if I have elements and each one of these chunks are in one, let's say square of a grid, and I have another chunk over here, those can shift around. So for instance, if I were to take this, because my thing's actually on a Bootstrap grid, so you'll see I have these two pictures here, right? So watch what happens when I collapse this. They'll kind of shift, so they'll scale a little bit. The elements can move around, but then eventually, oh, hang on a second, I gotta scroll down now. But eventually, it's a little weird here, but let's snap that. They'll actually stack. The elements themselves will stack on top of each other, instead of being, across. So you can see, so it allows you to basically decide at different moments, whether the elements can be on top of each other, whether, right now, these are 50-50, but I could have this one expanded to be 3/4 and this grid to only be 25. I can shift things around very easily if they're all inside of these different grid blocks, okay? So, some things that the grid generally deals with. One is organization. So, a lot of what you do when you do design is you're trying to take, you have a bunch of information. You have images, and you have text that's about, dogs, and text that's about cats, and text that's about, hamsters or whatever. You have all this different information, and you need to organize that information so that it's readable for the audience. If you just throw things all over the place, it makes it much more difficult to understand. So it seems kind of obvious, but grouping is a very important part of what you have to do as a designer. So, for instance, if I put this title next to this image, and then also this figure caption, you're automatically going to assume that these all go together. So I kind of group all those together. I have a title, the picture, and a figure, right? If I have a subtitle and then I put the text here, this is one group, then this one's another group. Because these are near each other, proximity automatically helps you have association. And again, I put a picture here, and I have a subtitle and text. I'm going to assume that all these items go together, but they're grouped together. If I had a picture of like, you know, George Washington, and this is an article about vanilla wafers, that doesn't make any sense, right? So I would take this and put this in the article over here that's about vanilla wafers. So it just helps to kind of group the information and put them next to each other so that it's easier to digest, okay? Another thing is hierarchy. So some information is going to be more important and others less so. So typically if you were to look at a typical layout, usually you have a title. That would be one of the first things you see. But the very most important thing that you're going to see, whatever page you go to, is going to be an image. And most of the websites you're going to see, they're going to have one large picture when you go to the site. And that's what's supposed to draw you in. Because they have color, it draws attention because they're big and it's more interesting. The next thing you would read basically would probably be the title because it's larger again, right? So the first thing you're going to look at is this picture. You're going to determine whether you like what it is. Then you're going to read the title and say, oh, it's about blah, blah, blah. Then what you might want to do is read these different articles here. But the way you're going to know whether to read this article here is you're going to look at the subtitle, right? This will draw your eye before this will. You won't just start reading this. You would read the subtitle first. And because it's larger and generally bold, it'll make it easier for you to see what each article is about, and then you know whether to read them, okay? But you have to have this hierarchy so that you can kind of see, you know, like this could say, My Little Pony, right? And you'd be like, oh, this whole page is going to be about My Little Pony, and you're not going to want to read any of it, especially if you see a big picture of My Little Pony. Now, you might see a picture of, like, Lord of the Rings. You're like, ooh, cool. And then you look up here and it's like, Lord of the Rings is cool. And then you're like, yeah, I'm definitely going to read that. And then you go down and read the rest of this, okay? I know some of you guys are bronies, but it's weird. Okay. So some other elements that we'd have to worry about. And you remember, like, a couple classes ago, I talked about, like, the art elements and design principles. This stuff is a little bit more relevant, like, more directly. It's still broadly graphic design, not specific to the web per se, but this is more specific to composition and page layout, okay? One thing you're constantly balancing is unity versus variety. So what you're always going to have to do is try to make your page seem cohesive. But you can make something very cohesive, but it'll be very boring. So for instance, if you look at this is actually very cohesive, right? It's all black and white text. It's gray images. So it's achromatic. It's very cohesive, but it's also very boring. You need to add like color, you know what I mean? And change fonts, right? So that the fonts are more interesting. Things like that. You have to add some variety, some flavor to it, or otherwise it'll be bland and the reader won't enjoy, they won't enjoy your layout. But if you have too much variety, right? So let's say you're taking a soup and you put some pepper and you put some salt in there and you're like, I want more variety. So you throw jelly beans into it, right? Yeah, it's going to make it more interesting. It's more variedied. But there's no unity there. So you have to kind of balance the two, where you have some variety, but not so much so that it takes away from the unity. And you want to have a lot of unity, but if it's just the one thing, it's going to be boring. Okay. Some other things to think about are style. The overall style of the page can kind of create a cohesive design, right? So, it sounds really stupid, but just simple things like your font choices. So if you use like, the, what do you call that? The ransom fonts, right? Now you can use those for your titles, and that would be like a cool style. Not really, but you could kind of have that go across. And all of your pictures are generally, they always have like frames around them, that look like calligraphy or something, and you could have sparkles or something. But that style you can use to kind of on all the elements throughout to kind of help make them unified, and also again create intrigue. Another thing is alignment. It helps block out the elements and also make it appear more cohesive. So we know we can group items by putting them next to each other, right? So I automatically assume that the subtitle is part of this. But another thing we can do too is just alignment. By having alignment, it helps these elements fit this as well, because they're both sharing this line. It helps draw your eye down, and it helps make disparate elements seem more together. So for instance, this title and this picture and this fig caption and this subtitle and so on and so forth, they're all following this left alignment, and it helps your eye flow down, and it also makes the elements themselves seem part of each other, even though each one of these are a separate little grouping, okay? And the same thing here and the same thing here, right? So this picture shares the same alignment as this, helps these two different things be together. So alignment's very important. White space. So white space is the negative space around an object. So you remember we talked about positive and negative space. So generally white space is the negative space. That is one of the biggest things that you're going to see with graphic design. It's a lot more different than, let's say, fine arts. A lot of times with fine arts, they're usually trying to fill the page with oh, I guess I could use those. With graphic design, we usually try to have a lot more open space around because it'll help draw attention. So if you're trying to have something stick out, most of the time what you do is you might make that element like more colorful than the things around it, or you might make it bigger than the things that are around it, or you might make it be bolder. There's a lot of different things you could do to try and draw emphasis to one particular element. But if you really want to make something stand out, the best way to do it is to put a lot of white space around it. If you put a lot of white space around something, it's going to draw your eye to it more. So, like if you look at this image, for instance, right? There's a lot of white space. They could have filled this whole thing up, but they put a lot of white space around it, and it helps draw your eye into these stupid watches, okay? Color. Obviously, color can help create emphasis. It will also draw, It'll also draw attention and what have you. Generally speaking, when you come up with a design, you should try and limit your number of colors so that it makes it more cohesive. Size, obviously, larger objects will stand out more than smaller ones, and images draw more attention than others. So I just kind of wanted to show you a couple examples of like the grid and these elements I was just discussing up here. So these are actually, just because they're two competing companies, I decided to use these two because I think they're funny. This might be old now because I think I did this like a year or two ago. But I just screen captured the front page of Apple.com and Microsoft.com. And if you look, they're basically the same design, right? So at the top, we've got the Apple logo, the Microsoft logo. We got a nav bar, right? A nav bar. It's got the search, it's got the search, it's got the login, it's got the login. Then there's a call to action, one big picture, which is like the thing that they're trying to draw your attention to. Now, generally, most of the time what you're going to see, especially if it's a company that's that has a product line, they will make a slider. So if you look, I don't know if you can see it here, but there's these little things. This is actually a slideshow. Same thing here. This is also a slideshow. This one's got these little dashes. This one's got little dots, okay? Then you'll see they have 4 pictures that are basically like products or articles you can go to. Boom, 4 pictures that are products that are articles you can go to. Now you'll notice that what they decided to do was put the words in the images themselves. They decided to put them underneath. Then after that, they went a little bit different here where they did another picture and then these sub pictures. But you can see there's clearly a grid that they're following. And then at the very end, they have all the legal and what have you. And what do you notice? Hey, it's the same basic thing, right? And again, this also follows a grid. You know, if you look at the line here, you can follow this line straight up, and it follows right with that, okay? Now, some things they did to try and add interest and also make it cohesive is that what you'll notice is none of these colors are too crazy. The most crazy colors are probably like this one right here, which draws your eye the most. But generally, they kind of desaturated the pictures. And use sort of pastel-y colors where they could. You know, they kind of grayed a lot of the stuff out here. In this picture, they actually grayed out. Because if this was color, it would actually stick out a bit more. One of the ways that they solved it over here is that you see they did this kind of blackish, grayish gradient that they overlay of all these pictures. And what that does is it helps the images be more cohesive together because they all share that same element. And they generally desaturate the pictures a little bit, and they're also all pictures of people. So they all have skin tones in them as well, which also helps draw them together. Okay, but you can see they basically did the same design, and they both are following the grid format. And if you look at any, especially professional-looking sites where they're trying to get trust and stuff from you, you're gonna see that's always going to be the case. So most of the time, you're going to see that kind of thing. So one of the things that we can use is and the next assignment we're going to do is we're going to make a Bootstrap site, and that Bootstrap is built on a grid system. There's another grid system called the 960 grid system, which was something that I used to use, but this is what we call a fixed width grid, which means that You know how I showed you that when I squish my web page, the items will actually shift around and even stack on top of each other, or they'll scale and things like that. It's responsive, as what you would call that. The fixed width is not responsive. It's 960 pixels across, and that's it. It's just 100% what it is. However, I'm going to tell you what you want to do is click on this to download the grid system, because it has a template that we can use in order to lay out your wireframe for your next assignment. Okay, but this is actually a slideshow they have from it. But I thought it was interesting because this would still apply no matter what system you're using. But you can see, like, here's a website, right? That looks neat. But when I go to the next one, yeah, come on, you can see it's using, this is 12, right? Yeah, it uses 12 grids. But you can see each column. We have our columns, which is the red, and the gutter, which is the white, or the see-through part. Okay. But you can see all of these elements clearly follow this grid. Okay, you guys can do this if you want. But there's another one, kind of a typical looking thing. Again, you see all the elements are fitting into these columns. Okay. So anyway, and you can read that if you want. This is an example I made for class or whatever, but you can see the exact same thing. It basically follows the exact same thing as you saw up there. And you can see what I did here in order to make my images match together. Is that I gave everything kind of a sepia tone, which sort of desaturated it, but it made the images not, not so disparate from each other. Okay, but again, it follows just that basic grid system. Okay. All right, and then I'll just do a separate video for that. All right, so that is the grid.